By way of background, this bill would fulfill one of the recommendations that came out of the governor's task force on the Seacoast Cancer Cluster. I chaired that task force under both Governor Hassan and Governor Sununu, and there were 5 sites that were identified in the Seacoast that were concerned to the public about possible contamination. And, one of those sites was Seabrook Station, and so we did an investigation of each of the 5 sites. And when we looked at Seabrook, one of the large concerns that came out of the investigation of Seabrook, which was not a deep investigation, but it involved testimony from people who monitor Seabrook from south of the border in Massachusetts. One of the stark areas where we were missing monitoring was north of the border. So when you think of it, Seabrook sits down in the southeastern portion of the state, right on the coast, and there's an arc of monitors that are maintained by a group called C10 under contract from the state of Massachusetts that arcs around, and they could tell you in more detail exactly where their monitors are. But these are real-time monitors to immediately detect increased levels of radioactivity that might reflect a leak or a possible hazard at Seabrook Station. We heard testimony that there is at least one monitor north of the border, but that essentially that active monitoring stops north of the border. At the time of the cancer cluster investigation, the only other active monitor was in Concord, in New Hampshire. And I'm not sure about monitoring over at the Naval Shipyard, which also has some nuclear material on base. So the concern that we had was what would happen in the event of an accident. We heard testimony that at 3 Mile Island, it was 3 days before the public was fully informed, and they did not have the active monitoring. So part of the recommendations of the task force was to close the hemicircle or the half circle and bring the monitoring up north around Seabrook Station to be sure that the public would have independent, active, real-time monitoring that would be available to provide at least some measure of alarm if there is an accident or a breach, and it would be independent. There is, to be sure, there is monitoring north of the border, but if you've ever seen a radiologist, and I wear one when I do fluoroscopy, we have a little badge that tells how much exposure we've had. That's passive monitoring. That's not active monitoring. So those are assessed once a month. I turn mine in once a month, and they tell me if I'm glowing in the dark or not. But in terms of actually being able to react to an accident, we are dependent on monitors that are inside the facility, or the monitors on the Massachusetts side. So what this bill does, and Peter Somssich, state rep from Portsmouth, is the force behind it, is to establish the rest of the arc and to provide the same level of safety net and monitoring north of the border as exists south of the border. There is some cost associated with it. This does have an FN, and it would have to go to finance. There is an amount that is paid by Seabrook to the state for this type of process, but whether that amount could be increased to cover the cost is not clear at this point. And that would be something that certainly I'd be willing to work with the Finance Committee on looking at what the actual cost would be. But on a policy side, this reflects recommendation of the commission, of the task force, and living in Rye, this certainly would be something that is a big concern to my constituents, to me, to my family, to my constituents in the 11-town area, that also both includes Seabrook and is an arc around Seabrook. I want to be clear about one thing. This is not any kind of reflection on Seabrook Station or its operators. This is not raising any kind of negative image. It is merely closing the loop on safety monitoring for a nuclear facility. So with that, I'll take any questions. I'm in charge.
I'm in charge. How do I ask a question when I'm in charge?
Thank you. What I'm curious about is there any way that Seabrook Station has a responsibility to pay for these monitoring stations? I mean, we've been trying to get these in place now for 6 or 8 years. And have we ever tried to get Seabrook to cover the costs of this?
That's a great question. Seabrook, I won't speak for them, but they do provide funding for safety and to the Department of Health and Human Services. We were just talking before the hearing that we're going to get together and talk about what that comprises, what it's being used for, and so that when this goes, if this goes on to finance, we'll be able to be clear about whether we can either increase the amount that we ask for from Seabrook or whether there is funding already available. I would add that Representative Somssich has been working to get at least the initial cost, the capital cost of installing all of this covered with private funds. And at this point, he has about $30,000 worth of pledges toward the project.
Follow up, but there's the question of the installation, but then there's also the question of maintaining the monitoring, and who would be in charge of that, and how much would that cost?
So the answer to that, it would be up to the department to contract with either a provider or to do it themselves. C10 does that whole function south of the border, and they've done it for many years under contract with the state of Massachusetts. So I'm sure, looking at what is the least expensive but best result would be the next step.
Following up on that, it's I think a demonstration of how concerned people are on the seacoast that we don't have these monitors, that they've already been able to raise $30,000, but that's a one-time effort. So I think we need to take that into consideration and see that, as this is something that people want, but we really have to ensure that, and I'm happy to speak to this in front of finance, that not only is it important to put the monitors in place, but to understand what is the cost of maintaining them through a contract. And I know that Ken is here and they can speak to that, but I just wanted to get that into the record that, we could see on the one hand there's something very positive about the private sector coming forward and wanting to help, but we also need to recognize that those are one-time dollars.
Yep, I agree.
Yes,
the bill puts this into Health and Human Services. Fiscal note says that the EPA already has two, one in Portsmouth, one in Concord, pretty much per your testimony. I don't understand why DES isn't the one who's responsible for this. But when we get into water and other services such as that, monitoring, chemicals and different things, that they're the ones who does it for that.
somebody behind me might be able to answer why they're the ones, but DHHS is the licensee for Seabrook. So I believe that's the case. In other words, they are the ones who oversee licensure. I think it's true, but we can ask them. But in any case, the safest answer is that I would defer to DES and DHHS for who would actually be the ones who oversee this and why.
Vote.
Having some experience with the Fort Naval Shipyard, I know that there is monitoring at the shipyard, and since Seabrook has to follow the same general rules that the shipyard has to follow, there certainly could be lots of monitors at Seabrook, but they're just not reporting to. Is that correct?
They actually do have, we know that they have active monitors within their perimeter. The issue is independent monitoring. The Department of Defense has a completely different protocol, and as you said, some of that we may not know, although when we looked into the shipyard, the Naval Shipyard, they were very forthcoming and very open about their reports, and it was very thorough, and they were happy to work with us. So they do have monitors, and Portsmouth has a monitor, which, by the way, is new since the task force was in place. But this array of monitors that the public would like to see as independent monitoring does not exist north of the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border.
Any follow-up question?
No.
Are you here?
Very simple question, and we have Michelle Roberge, who is the head of that area, and we also have with us Dr. Barinelli, who's here as well, and to answer the question, why us and not DES, even though we love our partnership with DES. I was looking at Jared.
So if name and position and
My name is Michelle Roberge, and I'm the Bureau Chief for the Public Health Protection within the Division of Public Health Services.
And I'm Lou Barinelli, B-A-R-I-N-E-L-L-I. I'm the Program Manager for the Public Health Laboratory, Water Analysis Lab, which also encompasses our Radiological Chemistry Laboratory.
for DHHS.
For DHHS, yes, sir.
So, do you have anything you want to say, or can we ask questions?
You can feel free to ask questions.
The number one question that I would love to have answered was Senator Gray's question about who is in charge of this, and I assume it's you all, and then why.
Yes. So I think there's maybe two reasons that certainly come to mind. One, the Division of Public Health Services has the Public Health Lab that does a significant amount of monitoring.
In the Department of Public Health Services, Public Health Laboratory, the radiochemistry lab is tasked with emergency preparedness around radiological events and radiological surveillance. So that's one of our missions and our tasks.
And when they apply for a license, when Seabrook Station applies for a license to be continued, am I correct, is that part of DHHS, or is that NRC?
That's NRC. So DHHS also has the radiological health group section, but that is primarily focused on emergency response preparedness, and they work pretty closely with Homeland Security and local agencies and Seabrook to, in the event of an emergency, to make sure we have a robust emergency response and preparedness program. So the license is still through the federal NRC.
Any other questions? Senator Floyd Clark.
This is a little off the subject of the monitoring, but are you also in charge of working with Seabrook if the monitoring was to find, there was a release of radiological particles into the air, and how do you work with them to deal with the public?
Yes, I mean, that would probably fall under our emergency response group. And so we, along with other agencies, Homeland Security and local agencies, would be looking at, the release, the level of the release and the appropriate response that if it would be needed in that instance. So we would work together as a team.
So I know that every year, everyone within a certain radius of Seabrook receives a calendar with also the instructions about what to do in the event of an emergency, but it is woefully inadequate. And I think it would be important just to take that message back.
Sure, and I certainly can do that. I know the department is part of that too, and I'm happy to share those.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. Representative Somssich.
Thank you, committee members, for this opportunity to support SB 181, and I'll be relatively brief. So last year, the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee of the House reported out an identical bill to SB 181 with an ITL, with a slim majority to ITL, the bill. As a physicist and one who has had extensive knowledge of both the potential benefits of and the real risks involved with the use of radioactive materials, including the operation of nuclear reactors, I was quite surprised that the legislature was not willing to provide the same level of radiation safety in the 10-mile emergency planning zone, the EPZ, around Seabrook nuclear plant to the 17 New Hampshire cities and towns, as is currently being enjoyed by the towns and cities in Massachusetts, who are likewise in that very same zone, and who currently receive this kind of monitoring through the contract with C10. Since 1993, that group has been under contract from the Department of Safety of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to provide real-time monitoring data of any airborne radioactive materials, including wind speeds and wind direction. And while this is indeed a 21st century technology, the current New Hampshire monitoring system, based on a very primitive passive monitoring technology from the 1960s, is definitely not up to par. Since the cost of setting up an equivalent monitoring system in New Hampshire was estimated last year with the fiscal note on the bill to be an initial $60,000 for the first year and $40,000 for the second year, or a total of $100,000 for setup of such a network, it seemed to me that this is an amount that could easily be absorbed into the current annual emergency planning budget of, I believe, $1.2 million. That is currently expended in support of the safety procedures and processes required by the operators of Seabrook nuclear plant. I suspect further that replacing the old film strip plaques, which Chairman Sherman mentioned and I also wore many years, with the newer real-time monitoring system, which is these plaquettes, incidentally, which are only evaluated every 90 days. Replacing those plaquettes, film strips, with new real-time monitoring technology would not really be a financial burden. After all, those monitors would have to be sent out, taken down from the telephone poles, sent out for analysis, and then that costs something. By contrast, the real-time monitoring is already in place. You don't need anything else than that. When the bill was voted ITL by the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, I decided that raising $100,000 from public donations is a very doable goal. That is why I started the Citizens Initiative to expand radiological safety monitoring approximately 6 months ago. This group's goal is to initially collect at least $60,000 in pledges towards our goal of setting up a publicly funded effort before we go ahead and begin installing such a system. Currently, we already have over $33,000 in pledges, and we are confident that we shall reach that goal of $60,000 within the next 6 months. If the state of New Hampshire agrees to go ahead in collaboration with NextEra Energy, the owners of Seabrook, to set up an equivalent monitoring system to the one in Massachusetts, our group would be willing to contribute to this effort with the pledges that we have collected at that time. So I encourage this committee to support this bill, and if passed, request that the New Hampshire Department of Safety move quickly to provide all the 17 towns and cities in New Hampshire the same level of safety currently enjoyed by the Massachusetts towns. So thank you very much. I have copies of my written statement as well as a copy of the Citizens Initiative effort that I'm involved with.
Thank you for your testimony. Senator Clark?
Yes, could you tell the committee how the monitoring is paid for in Massachusetts?
Excuse me?
Could you tell the committee how the monitoring is paid for in Massachusetts? And is it up to date?
Well, I don't know that much about the practical operations of that. I think there are people from C10 here who will give you the details. I mean, my understanding is they have contracts with the state of Massachusetts. And I would like to also underscore at this point one component here. If the state of New Hampshire decides not to do this, our group will do it. We'll set up our own publicly funded monitoring system, and we'll start reporting out data. That would be a very foolish thing to do, but it would put the state under the pressure that they should be in charge of these kind of critical decisions about safety alerts and things like that, which is what we'd like them to do. So, and certainly the Seabrook operators would also have a public relations issue on their hands, because their data is limited to the fences and these poles. They don't have any wind speeds, they have no wind direction anywhere else except those poles and the fences. So if outside the perimeter in the New Hampshire towns we have a separate monitoring system giving real-time information out, we cannot really operate without the cooperation of both the state and the operators. That would be a foolish thing to do. So, but C10 will tell you more about the details of how they operate. They will be testifying as well.
Any further questions? Thank you very much.
He's chairing his own committee right now.
Oh, okay. Let's see, Representative Cushing.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, I'm Representative Renny Cushing from Rockingham District 21, the town of Hampton. A portion of the NextEra facility is in the community, and I'm here to speak in support of this bill. Like Dr. Sherman, I too served on the Governor's Task Force on the Seacoast Cancer Cluster, and I was somewhat surprised at the lack of real-time monitoring that exists in the New Hampshire Seacoast. And I was even more interested to find out, have discussions with the state of New Hampshire, that the only monitor at the time that was active was in Concord. And even more surprised to find out that that monitoring system had detected radiation from the Fukushima nuclear disaster. I think that it is important to the health and safety of the people living within the exclusion zone of the NextEra's plan of the Seabrook atomic plant, that there be real-time on-site monitoring. Senator Phil Clark alluded to the calendars that we get every year as the means by which we update ourselves on how to evacuate in the course of a nuclear accident. There is, at the current time, a mechanism by which there's an assessment upon the utility that helps underwrite the expenses of emergency preparedness. What is lacking in all of this is that part of the emergency preparedness plan does not include real-time monitoring off-site. And I think, at least in the New Hampshire towns, It's interesting that, you know, Salisbury, Mass. has monitors. I live 3 miles as the radiation flies from the Seabrook station, and there are no radiation monitors in my town where a portion of the plant is located. I think that there's been a number of changes in the situation concerning the Seabrook atomic plant since it was first licensed. One of the major developments I think happened 10 years ago was it was discovered that there was a ASR concrete cancer, if you will, that for whatever reason the Seabrook atomic plant is the only nuclear generating facility in the country that is undergoing a chemical reaction within its concrete that is deteriorating the plant itself. And on the one hand, you've got a plant where there's not a set, to my knowledge, a satisfactory assessment of the potential for degradation of public safety because of the ASR, and yet the plant is moving full speed ahead to be licensed for another 40 years. I know in Massachusetts the cost for the for the monitoring is borne by a utility assessment. New Hampshire opted not to do something similar, but I think we were remiss in that. When the state decided it wasn't going to oppose the relicensing of Seabrook, the state of New Hampshire, I mean, I think it missed a golden opportunity to stand on, to ask questions and to make demands, if you will, requirements that the plant provide real-time monitoring to citizens in the area. I would note that the Seabrook station is a merchant plant, unlike when it was first built. The merchant plant, what the merchant plant does not do, the externalities that are the imposition of costs to the health and safety of people in the community are not paid for by the plant. They're imposed upon the people who live in the area. And it's just a matter of equity and fairness that the plant that's operating pay for monitoring and pay for public health and safety. I would further note that the state of New Hampshire legislature, in its wisdom, has mandated tax exemptions for portions of the plant that that are in amount to millions of dollars a year to subsidize the operation of the plant. That you could, the state, that if there's a question about a source of revenue, just close, end the giveaway, close the tax loophole, and with the money collected, dedicate that to the monitoring of public safety if NextEra is not amenable to doing that on its own. And with that, I would urge the committee to pass this legislation.
In your opinion, is it too late to put in place a utility assessment onto the plant?
In my opinion, there is a utility assessment that's now. I think the utility assessment needs to include, I think the state of New Hampshire needs to require that there be off-site monitoring as part of the emergency preparedness plan. I think it should be a public safety mandate.
Just follow up on that. So this is a pretty broad piece of legislation. Should we be amending it to say that the monies from this should come from the assessment that's already being placed on Seabrook with regard to emergency preparedness?
Yes, I think it should be, this should define that in order, as a component of the emergency preparedness plan for the evacuation of the 10-mile radius around the Seabrook project, that there should be real-time monitoring that's part of that plan so that the public health and safety can be, that the plan needs to be upgraded so that it's state-of-the-art and it doesn't rely upon the technology that existed 40 years ago when the plant was first licensed. It's a no-brainer that it should be a component of any attempt to relicense.
So just clarification one more time.
Yeah.
That more specific language is not in this bill.
That's correct. We would be willing to help you define that specific language.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions for Representative Cushing? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Representative Messner. Welcome back.
Former representative. House Representative for District 24, Mindi Messner. I'm an environmental scientist by background for 30 years and also have a degree in public health from Georgetown recently. I, like Senator Sherman, came to this with a concern raised out of the task force for the pediatric cancer cluster investigation and the following work on the commission as well here in the State House. I gave 2 documents out to the committee. The first is a newspaper article about the cancer cluster, the cancer rate. We know that in the last year we found out that the CDC has determined that the state of New Hampshire has the highest rate of pediatric cancer in the nation. We also have recently found out that New Hampshire also has the highest rates of bladder, breast, and esophageal cancer, and additionally very high rates in the top 5 for thyroid and liver cancer. So these are very concerning issues in addition to the pediatric cancer cluster that we detected on the seacoast. And my concern rises out of that work that we need to know as a public in the seacoast what our exposure is to radiation. We know that radiation is emitted from the plant during normal maintenance activities. It's well documented in the literature. And it is a concern of mine and as well as people of my town and the community I live in the seacoast that we don't know what our exposure is to the releases from the plant. We also know that there is an issue with ASR, and there are people here that are going to talk to that more, probably better than I could, about the degradation of the concrete and whether or not that would cause a release of radiation to the public, as well as my concerns about sea level rise and the impacts that would have on the plant as well. The second document, so I should have mentioned, this is the same bill last year that passed the House as Representative Somssich said, came out of committee with an ITL by a slim margin, and also failed on the House floor by a very slim margin of 8 votes. So there certainly was, the House did come close to passing this bill last year, out of concern for the cancer rates, I believe, in the seacoast. As well as the second sheet of paper that I gave you was an information request that I received last year associated with HB 1779 that talks about the utility assessment. And the plant has given, Nextera has, or whoever it was before Nextera, has given annual assessments to the state. Last assessment I have on record here is fiscal year 2016, which was $2.8 million. And I believe they received federal match funds also for the state for emergency preparedness. And when you compare that to the fiscal note, I believe the capital cost associated with setting up this monitoring system is a small fraction of the money that Nextera gives to the state. And like Representative Cushing says, the state of Massachusetts has decided to use some of that funding that they get from the utility assessment to set up and conduct this monitoring since, I believe, 1993. So this money that has come from Nextera, or the predecessor, has come since, I believe, 1984. The fund was set up in 1981 as listed on this legislative request. So I think it is the public's right to know what their exposure is, and it's data that we need to know to assess whether or not it's responsible for the cancer issue that we have in the seacoast. There's also up to 3 times, I believe probably more now, we just have another report of another glioblastoma on the seacoast that is significantly higher than expected brain and central nervous system cancers in our children in the seacoast. So I would ask that you support this legislation. I believe there is going to be, and was last year, a feeling that this should pass in the House as well. And I'd love to answer any questions if you have any.
Senator Clark.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Messner. I'm glad to see you here today. My question to you is, do you know what are the real-time monitoring systems that are set up around the other nuclear plants? We only have 2 others that exist now in New England.
I would defer that question to Ms. Hill, who would answer that probably much better than I could.
Any other questions? Thank you for your testimony. Did you provide the...
I did give copies before the request for both documents.
Megan Lahey and Dave Robinson of Nextera.
My name is Mehan. I'm the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs for NextEra Energy Resources, and I'll let my colleague introduce himself as well.
My name is Dave Robinson. I'm the Chemistry Manager of the Seabrook Nuclear Plant.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the time today, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate the opportunity to speak in front of you this afternoon. We're here to present our testimony in opposition to this legislation, and I'll lay out some of the reasons for that opposition, and Dave is gracious enough to be here from the site to provide some background on our monitoring programs. By way of brief background, NextEra Energy Resources is the majority owner and operator of the Seabrook plant. We're one of the largest wholesale generators of electricity in the country. We're also the world's leader in renewable generation from wind and solar. We have 2 other merchant plants in Iowa and Wisconsin. We have one of the largest nuclear fleets in the nation. Here in New England, aside from the Seabrook station, of course, we have a very large presence. We're also making large investments in new renewable generation. For example, we just won 4 new solar projects in the recent Connecticut RFP. So we're making a big push for new development in New Hampshire and in the region. Seabrook Station, as some of you may know, some may not, we safely and reliably generate electricity for about 1 million homes and businesses. That's 1,200 megawatts of baseload, emission-free generation. We employ about 500 people, highly skilled, highly qualified professionals at the plant, and we pay approximately $17 million annually in state and local taxes currently. We're very proud of our long-standing commitment to environmental stewardship. We're very proud to be a good corporate citizen and neighbor, and we take that very seriously. A couple of reasons I just wanted to lay out for our opposition today. One, extensive radiological monitoring is already occurring in the emergency planning zone around Seabrook. And this has been occurring since 1982. That's 8 years before the plant was even operating. Second, and maybe of more interest to this committee, continuous radiation monitoring is also occurring at more than 80 sites on our property and at the plant. Our monitoring program is inspected by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, our regulator. And Seabrook has a professional staff of highly trained professionals with individuals on duty 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Lastly, and I think most important, radiation protection has always been the top priority for the station. There has never been a radiological incident associated with Seabrook operations. It's for these reasons that we firmly believe the system and the outline proposed or contemplated in this legislation would not in any way increase the safety or the protection for the health of the public, and it would create a costly and redundant addition to the New Hampshire state government. So I'll stop there and I'll ask Dave to walk through our program and hopefully give you a better sense of what we do on the station every day.
So, good afternoon. I'm glad that I have an opportunity to speak today. I am represented by at least a couple of you in this room. I live in Rye. I was born and raised and lived in Portsmouth for 44 years. I've been in Rye for 17. I have a rather large family. I have 7 children and 14 grandchildren. They live in Northampton, Dover, Portsmouth. I have relatives that live in Seabrook and Northampton. So I'm pretty well entrenched in the Seacoast area. I've worked at Seabrook for 38 years. I started as the first chemistry technician hired there, and I've been able to work my way through positions of increasing responsibility, and have been chemistry manager for the last 10.5 years. The radioactive effluent program is a very thorough monitoring of plant effluents that is, I'm going to say, consistent with NRC regulations. We meet the requirements, and we were recently inspected by the NRC as recent as last week. We had no findings, no recommendations. In fact, parting words were, "You have a solid program." As part of the on-site monitoring, whether it be area monitors in the plant or effluent monitors, they are maintained by a highly qualified and trained workforce. We use standards that are traceable to the National Institute of Standards, NIST. We have a periodic program to ensure that the monitors are reliable all day, every day. We have an alarm system that the monitors report readings to, not only alarms, but monitor readings to the control room. We have trending capability. The operators monitor the plant systems as well as radiation levels in the plant. And as some of you probably know, there are trigger levels, and when these monitors reach a certain level, the emergency plan is activated. I'll offer to you that if we enter an action that requires the emergency plan activation, we're required to notify the states of New Hampshire and Massachusetts within 15 minutes. That's whether it's 2 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's real-time monitoring. It occurs at the plant, and it's very similar to smoke detectors. That I'll ask you, where would you rather have a smoke detector? In your bedroom, or in your hallway outside the bedroom, maybe in the living room? Or would you rather have it on your neighbor's fence or on their front porch? So in either case, they'll alarm when smoke is detected. But I sure would want to be notified by an alarm system in my house so that I can take prompt action. I've heard a lot of talk about real-time monitors off-site. I have some experience with the, I'll say, the plant end of the C10 monitors. And I'll offer you that we have a Met tower on site. Monitors wind speed and direction at 2 elevations. We have temperature monitoring. We have solar radiation monitoring, so we can determine what the adiabatic lapse rate is, which is the ability of the air to move up. We have a rather elaborate process that's used in determining or projecting what doses would be in the event of an emergency. All that is done by highly trained and qualified, proficient people that work at the plant. And we interface with the state. We interface with a number of the people in the Department of Environmental Services. And they support us in the EOF, Emergency Offsite Facility for Seabrook. They work with us in the Incident Command Center, all in context to make sure that the public is notified early enough so that they can take appropriate action. Recommendations come from the station, and the state implements based on their decisions. So as far as real-time monitoring, I don't think you can get much better than 15-minute notification. So that's fairly rapid response as far as I'm concerned from the plant. I've heard a little bit of talk about monitors that we have off-site. We take samples, whether it be milk, broadleaf vegetation, water, lobsters, clams, fish. We take samples of them to see what the long-term effects would be of radiation that gets released. I will tell you it's often challenging to determine the difference between background and what the readings indicate. So a long-term trend is necessary to fully evaluate what's going on. We don't use film badges anymore. That technology died a long time ago. We use thermoluminescent dosimeters. They're very sensitive and they accumulate. I believe doctors wear the same. The accumulation is important because chronic low-level radiation has been shown to show a potential increase in the likelihood, and I have to say statistics can tell you a lot of things, the likelihood of cancer. I will also tell you from a personal note, as I do live in Rye, I'd much rather know what's going on at the plant with respect to radiation than to have to deal with 1,4-dioxin in the water table that's near the Coakley landfill. So, personally, radiation is mild compared to dioxin. So, we've been monitoring the area around Seabrook since 1982, as may have been mentioned, prior to the plant operation. So we obtained a pretty good baseline of data. We were able to detect the Fukushima radiation. The other nuclear plants in the country, along with Seabrook, all communicated with the NRC, with an organization called INPO, Institute of Nuclear Power Operations. INPO was created after 3 Mile Island. INPO is designed to help us achieve excellence. So they take the standards that are minimum and work with the industry to share best practices so that we can all improve. We've been doing that for a long time. So as I go back to Fukushima, we watched the radiation released from the plant come across the United States. We used the weather maps that you see that are tracking the snowstorms now. And each plant was able to pick up the changes in background radiation as a result of what came from Fukushima. Now that's very similar to what took place in 1986 with Chernobyl. Finland happened to be the first country to detect the radioactivity from Chernobyl before it came around the rest of the world. So news of significant events, accidents, travels fast. But I will go back to tell you, none faster than the 15 minutes that if we reach a trigger level at the plant, you'll be notified. And that may not be John Q. Public, but that will be the state of New Hampshire, state police, and word gets out in time for the public to take action. I have to go back to that's real-time monitoring. So, if you haven't guessed, I am very proud of our system. I'm very pleased that it is thorough and accurate, and that we report results in a report, and I have a copy of last year's report, which ends up on the NRC webpage for all to read. There are also reading rooms in Seabrook and Amesbury where the documents can reside. So I won't say that this gets mailed to everybody's house, but it is available. And I will offer the committee an opportunity to come to Seabrook, and I'd be more than happy to show you our equipment and give you a tour. I agree with Megan that this is a bill that would increase cost with no benefit. When somebody says that Seabrook is a merchant plant, yes. A merchant plant means they are not included in the PUC. We don't have our rates set so that we can ensure a profit. We work hard. We improve on our efficiency. We minimize excessive cost. Seabrook has operated at 100% power for several cycles, uninterrupted. We have a tremendous operating cycle, operating history, all safely done with a highly qualified staff. So we urge you not to support the proposed legislation, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Really appreciate it. Senator Fuller Clark.
Yes, I want to thank you for your testimony, and to say that I have had the opportunity to tour Seabrook a number of times, the Seabrook plant, and I commend you for the way you run the plant and the services and education you provide to the public. I do have some questions for you, however. One is, as I understand it, you also pay a certain amount of money to Massachusetts with regard, as you requested, and that money is used to pay for monitors in Massachusetts. So what is the difference between having monitors in like Salisbury, Mass, but not having any monitors in New Hampshire, these sort of, independent, if you wish, off-site monitors?
So I'll tell you, I don't have any of the details. I do know that C10 is funded from the Massachusetts General Fund. I do not believe Seabrook pays the emergency preparedness fees to Massachusetts and they end up in C10.
It would be helpful to have some more information about that.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, Senator, I'll just add that he is correct. The money comes from the general funds with a line item in the budget in Massachusetts to the Department of Public Health, where they then contract that out to CT.
But do you have monies that you pay to Massachusetts, and do any of those monies go into the general fund?
I don't know.
I mean,
We can find out for you.
Money's fungible.
Yep, yep.
But anyway, it would just be interesting. And what is the rationale why Massachusetts feels that it's important to have these monitoring, independent monitors? And we're hearing from you that they're not necessary. So that's just, I think there's an anomaly there that we need to wrap our minds around.
So if I could answer you with a little different than you expect answer. So occasionally we have fluctuations in radiation levels in the background. You read information, and in the area that we live in, we could have potentially 100 to 200 millirem per year exposure. If you live in Denver, Colorado, it could be as high as a couple thousand millirem. If you were to monitor the Merrimack River for radiation over a period of time, 5 years, 10 years, you would see a trend that just about every spring there's an increase in radiation levels in that river. And that's because of the runoff from the snow in the mountains. So fluctuations in radiation are normal. All right, we live in that every day. There have been times when the C10 network has shown an increase in radiation, and they've asked the plant, did you do anything? I know because I was asked. We look at what went on, what the plant activity was doing, whether there was any release that occurred. Each time, the increase in radiation was due to a weather front. Coming from the west is likely. A lot of coal plants. So you get the washout when it rains. That's another indication. And so the detectors will respond. Yes. When do they get observed? Within 15 minutes of that increase? I don't think so. 8 hours of that increase? Probably. Okay, so real-time monitoring, I gotta go back. You monitor it at the source.
Thank you very much. I do have a comment that I would like to share with you. As I said earlier, it's not directly related to this.
Yeah.
But so if there were to be an incident and you're able to notify people within 15 minutes, how do you, one, do that? And secondly, how in the world does the evacuation plan that is currently in place considered workable for the seacoast?
So, I would say I probably am going to underestimate this a little bit. So the triggers that we have at the plant are set low enough so that we can adequately evacuate the public within a 4-hour window. And I will tell you that even Hampton Beach or Seabrook Beach, and I'll drag one of my relatives in here, Bruce Brown is my uncle. Okay? And I've worked at the Lobster Pound during the summer, especially on a Saturday or a Sunday night. And that traffic is pretty heavy. But I'll tell you, in 4 hours, you can clear that beach, especially in a rainstorm.
And especially with the new bridge.
Yes. So you can't do it in 15 minutes, but you can do it in 4 hours.
So all we need to do, comment though, is to sit in the traffic trying to get to Route 4,
Yes,
you know,
yes.
Route 33. So, I would just hope that there's a new look at the evacuation plan. And I hear you saying it can be done in 4 hours. I'm not sure that's credible now with the increase in population.
I understand.
What we see happening with gridlock.
I'll take that comment back, okay? And I'll also take back your comment on the calendar. I know I've received a couple of calendars from neighbors that didn't have the month of January in it,
My parents get a calendar.
so
Are
a
there
little aggravating.
any other questions? I just wanted to make a comment. I really appreciate you all coming today. We did ask you to come to the task force, and we were denied. And that was the task force that was put in place by the governor. So it's a little frustrating to ask you these questions and get this kind of answer, these answers, which I wish I had 3 years ago when we originally asked you to come. But better late than never, so I really appreciate it. And we are working on 1,4-dioxane.
And I was watching you from afar.
Thank you. So thank you for your testimony. Oh, one question.
I have
Go
some
ahead.
questions.
Okay.
Okay, so if I understand your testimony, you have 80 monitors on the site of the plant that provide the real-time monitoring with a 15-minute notification.
That's correct.
And then you go on to say your off-site monitoring system consists of more than 100 monitoring locations. So what radius are they from the plant? And are they a semicircle radius north, west, and south?
So they're in all sectors, and they go out to a distance of 20 miles.
They go out to a distance of 20 miles. Okay. And how often do you get the data back from them?
So, depends on the frequency of sampling. TLDs are quarterly, so it would take, I would say, roughly a month and a half to get the results back. We sample fish, we sample vegetation on a periodic basis, and we typically get the results back in 30 days. We publish the report annually, required by May 1st.
My last question. So when there were those weather-related events that you determined after the fact were weather-related, C10, I understand, saw a spike in radiological activity. Did the same spike occur at your on-site or locations?
So I'm going to say no. So the monitors that are detecting the background radiation off-site, and I'll say C10's values. So those are subject to, I'll just say, short-term changes. The monitors that are in the plant and monitor our plant systems have different thresholds than just background. They're often set at 1.5 and 2 times background, or at a value that will trigger an actual cause to assess an emergency condition. So our readings are a little higher than the ones that you can get off-site.
Okay. And I guess one last question. When, as you just stipulated, it was weather-related, in those instances, did some of the other independent monitoring, like C10, agree with that assessment?
Would you ask that again?
When there were the weather-related spikes, if you will, you testified that you thought it was believe it was weather-related. C10 and other independent assessments, NRC, whatever, did they agree with that assessment?
So I don't know. Oftentimes C10 will ask a question, they'll either ask the NRC resident inspector, or recently we've had some correspondence through emergency preparedness, and I typically provide the data. And in only one case that I'm aware of, C10 vehemently opposed what we said at that time, and this was back in the 1995-96 timeframe. At that point in time, Congressman Markey became involved, asked for a NRC inspection. The NRC sent a special team, Dr. Jason Jang and Lonnie Eckhart, to the site. Spent about a week. They agreed with our conclusion.
Thank you.
I had one quick question. Do you have controlled releases either through the waterway or air? That's the right word. In the air?
Atmospheric.
Yeah, atmosphere.
Yeah, we have gaseous and liquid releases, yes.
And follow, how much is released at those times? Is there?
So we have administrative limits that we set on our liquid waste. The values are typically 1,000 to 10,000 times below the NRC allowed limits. We take into account dilution, and we do not exceed any of the 10 CFR 20, Appendix B, Column 2 limits, and that's for liquid releases. For gaseous releases, we do a similar process, and we're one of the lowest plants for gaseous releases, other than tritium, in the country.
And why do those occur? Why are those necessary?
So, tritium from evaporation of the spent fuel pool. All right, so we get roughly 450,000 gallons of water at 80 degrees, and that evaporates, especially in the wintertime, with the dry humidity. Through, I'll just say, the process of operating the plant, there are activation products that when we need to ventilate the containment, we have a purge process. We sample containment prior to the release, and we sample it during the release so that we have a grab sample activity. We also go through 2 grad elements, the purge monitor, and we have a vent monitor. And we have set points on those monitors so that we understand whether or not there's something that could be occurring during that release. Those are typically short-term releases, less than 30 hours. During the refueling outages, we'll have long-term containment releases because it's open to atmosphere to allow people to move in and out. Liquid releases are mainly the result of diluting boron. Boron is the neutron absorber that maintains reactor power. Control rods are there to make sure the reactor is shut down if something were to go wrong. And so we have to continuously dilute the reactor system, and then we treat that water with resin to remove as much of the radioactivity as possible, again, other than tritium, and that gets released, all within limits.
How often?
We release probably 2 liquid discharges per week on average. Some weeks we don't release any, some we might do 4. So during the outage, we accumulate a fair volume of water, probably a couple 100,000 gallons. That's through all the flushing and maintenance activities. And we allow that to decay about 6 to 9 months. Main reason for that is cobalt-58 is the most prevalent nuclide that we have, and it has a 72 or 75-day half-life. So we try to get natural decay to help with the processing.
And you were talking earlier about the cumulative effect of radiation exposure, at least ongoing releases a couple times a week. I would assume there's some continual release. Are you detecting any radioactivity in the fish and shellfish samples that you're doing, or in the cow's milk samples?
So we will detect from time to time iodine 131, in either shellfish or water samples. That is typically associated with medical treatment. Our control location is in Ipswich Bay, and there is a hospital right there that will pick up activity. We have not seen increases in any cobalt 58, cobalt 60 in fish or shellfish. We've been challenged a number of times about strontium 90. Some people feel that strontium 90 will accumulate in mussel shells, clam shells. We don't analyze the shell because we don't eat shells, we eat the meat. And we have not seen strontium 90 in the meat of clams. In fact, the plant has never released strontium 90.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Very much.
Massachusetts since 1993 to operate our radiological monitoring network in the Massachusetts communities surrounding Seabrook, particularly the 10-mile emergency planning zone. I want to thank Dave and Megan for their testimony. We know that there are a lot of people at Seabrook, a lot of smart people with lots of resources working for the safety of the public here. And that, like Dave, they live here too. I live in Salisbury, Massachusetts myself, about 3.5, 4 miles from the plant with my husband and young daughter. So I took over at C10 about 2 years ago, and I'm learning a lot about the plant and our monitoring. But I can tell you that while it's terrific that there is real-time monitoring at the plant and that they have such a quick chain of communication, were there an emergency or unplanned release, I believe that what we do, the value that we add, is not only to help emergency planners and health officials to know in the event of an emergency, and I think that our wind speed and direction monitoring is helpful in that way, which incidentally, speaking of the terrible accident that happened around Fukushima, because they were not measuring wind speed and direction, they evacuated people to where the wind was blowing at first. So we do know that they monitor wind at the plant. I also read that they were cited for their meteorological station being down on multiple occasions at the plant. I believe that was in an NRC report last fall. So we're all on the same team for safety. There are a lot of people at various levels of government, the plant and C10 as well, who are concerned with the safety of those who live and work here near the plant and in the natural environment as well. So I like to think about us as an added level of watchfulness and security. I did pass around to you an overview sheet, and I can leave some more on the table for any folks in the room that are interested in picking one up. Just an overview sheet about our monitoring network that we operate, and I also passed along, I didn't bring the whole report, but what we do under contract with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health is we offer a monthly report of the readings that we take, and there are times, as Dave mentioned, that we pick things up. That time in the around 1995 timeframe, I believe, was when our monitors picked up 17 times above normal background level for a period of 5 hours, I believe, at several stations. So that was definitely a question of something going on, right? The page that I sent around is just an example of actually a night that State Representative Peter Somssich and I were speaking about the monitoring network, that in the wee hours we detected in our network for an hour or so, 3 stations, almost 4, that went above the radiation levels that are considered normal background on beta. Now there are different types of radiation that affect living things differently, and beta radiation, as shown there, is the non-penetrating, or I believe Dave will tell me if it's right, that it could come from noble gases. So we did call the plant after this incident, which we showed, the wind was blowing in the right direction, and these sites that particularly had spikes were around Plum Island area, Newburyport. And the resident inspector from the US NRC said, I can tell you we have unfettered access to the plant's data, there's nothing going on, it was probably a weather inversion. We said, okay, well, we're just watching and looking what's going on, but it was interesting to see that a week or so later, the Newburyport Daily News reported that it had been down for refueling at the time with 1,000 extra staffers doing all this great work and contributing to the economy. So that I wouldn't say nothing is going on if they're moving around radioactive materials at the site. Was it from that? Was it not? I don't know. But the point is, we are there watching, also 24/7 in the communities surrounding the plant. I will say that while we have never had state or private funding in large amount to do monitoring in New Hampshire, we have at times, and I'm proud to say now, we have 3 stations in New Hampshire that are somewhat cobbled together with bubblegum and spare parts. We would like to have that a little more reliable, thanks to the efforts spearheaded by Representative Somssich to get private funding to get this network going. We have laid out a plan to support those 3 existing stations, revamp them, and also build 3 new ones. The legislation in front of you does not mention C10. We support it regardless of whether we were contracted. We think that it's a good thing for the people of New Hampshire to have that same added level of safety and security that Massachusetts has enjoyed with, I should say, bipartisan support, especially in the legislative delegation in our 6 cities and towns in the 10-mile planning zone. We have had continuous legislative support and almost continuous funding except for 1 year. We are the only citizens independent group in the country that runs a monitoring network like this. When I've talked to others, I've learned that around Pilgrim Nuclear Plant, it's actually a legacy Boston Edison network, very analogous to us, that now the state runs and runs themselves. And there are a few other plants around the country that have something similar to this, but after 3 Mile Island and similar events, it was recommended that there were a much higher level of penetration of monitoring stations than what you see typically in the US. The EPA RadNet, which now has a site in Portsmouth and one here in Concord, those are important, but the fact is that it's a much lower level of penetration geographically and population-wise to provide that data. So I'm happy to answer questions, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there any questions? Senator Fuller-Clark.
So one question that was raised was with regard to the monitors that Seabrook Station has reported that they have. Are they up to date? Do they do what they ought to be doing in 2019?
At the plant?
Yes.
Well, I'm not going to answer that. I'm sure that Dave could tell you that they are state of the art. I'm sure they're shinier than the ones that we have on a level funded budget with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts all these years, to be honest. So I couldn't speak to those. I imagine that they are the real-time monitoring equipment that they have is quite adequate. And yes, they share when they get to an emergency level. Do they share in a true transparent way all the lower level releases? I've tried to look through these environmental effluent reports. It's very difficult for a layperson to make sense of what does it really mean public health wise. I know that there are some, including yourself, Senator Sherman, and Representative Messner, who are particularly concerned about the possible public health implications of living near a nuclear plant. We can't speak to that. We've never had the funding to look into our data so deeply, although we have decades of data. But I do know that in Europe and other parts around the world where they have studied, cancer rates around nuclear plants and things like that, they do see elevated levels. And I also know that the federal government had undertaken a study looking at cancer rates around nuclear plants, and they canceled that because they decided either it was too expensive or too hard to do. So there's a lot of unknowns. There's not no risk living near a nuclear plant, ongoing or in the rare event of an accident. We do know that there are a lot of people working for safety, and we see ourselves as a partner in that effort.
Thank you very much.
So, there are ongoing releases. Would your current network south of the border pick up those releases?
We can see little spikes. It doesn't mean that they're always 3 times above background levels, but there are these little puffs, right? I mean, it's like a fancy steam boiler. You've got a pot of water and you've got to open the lid. And so yes, they are permitted and regulated and allowed to do that, and they're lower than the levels federally allowed. Does that mean that there's no risk? It's difficult to say.
So the follow-up question would be, if you had New Hampshire-based monitors, would there be any enhanced monitoring? And again, the word that comes to mind is independent monitoring, cumulative exposure based on controlled releases. While the controlled releases are low and below, well underneath what the federal government says is safe, would there, one of the worries I have is cumulative data. Would that be more effective in picking up those controlled releases than where your current monitors are?
I don't know if it would be more effective. What would be more effective is funding to do research into the data, which on our shoestring we have not had much of. We have done some limited studies around the shellfish near the release pipe that have shown elevated levels of radiation exposure. I mean, we know that the number is not 0. The question is, at what point does it affect public health and the environment? That is a tricky one, and that there's always, as we know, in environmental health, multi-factors. We live in a world that is not pristine anymore, so it would take some money and some drilling down to really look at that. The effects and the causality is always hard to tease out.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Senator Brown.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to understand what your organization does. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't do the type of monitoring that's done by the plant on site. In other words, the 15-minute continuous.
No, we do real-time monitoring as well. I have one monitoring network administrator, not as many as Dave has, but we are looking at it all the time. He's a guy that doesn't sleep a lot. He's looking at things on the go. He's got his phone. We have this whole protocol that happens when we do get alerts, where Mike Messner and myself, as well as who are the C10 staff, and folks from the Mass DPH, Department of Public Health, and NEMA get alerts. And so we can see if things go above 3 times above normal background level of beta or gamma, and then Mike will pull off the alert, he'll see what happened, he'll check the logs, he'll check the wind speed and direction, and then we'll talk to the resident inspectors of the NRC at the plant, just to tell them what we have and see if they want to corroborate or anything.
But, so if you have real-time monitoring, you have 24-hour staff?
We don't have 24-hour staff that are awake all the time, but we have a guy with a cell phone next to his bed. That's what we've got for the budget we've got, So we do know when things are going on. We know we're not the first line of defense, and we are not an early warning system for the public. We aren't the ones who send out an alert. We work with the state so that if they see this data coming through, we work together. And obviously the plant, they're the ones that are really on the hook and have the real hotline to know if there's something that, But again, we are an extra layer that can complement both the TLDs hanging on the telephone poles that measure passive data every 3 months and the real-time monitoring at the plant. We see ourselves in partnership with that. We're all working to get more information that could be used in the event of an unplanned release and to give us more data day to day.
I'm just trying to understand this. So whenever you see a spike, then you report that to the NRC at the plant. And
We call and check in.
Yeah, and you would report it to the Department of Health in Massachusetts.
We do, they get the alerts at the same time, staff from the Department of Public Health and Mass Emergency Management, and we talk about that. We have offered and met with counterparts here in New Hampshire from Perry Plummer, Department of Public Safety, and Mike Dumond and his team and Lou. So we've offered to collaborate either way, to share data. Certainly, I think the last time I met you, Senator Bradley, was when I worked with Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, and you know the value of states working together and leveraging, so we have offered on that.
That's what I'm trying to understand.
We have offered through that to work together. If the state decides to either run on their own or contract elsewise, we would still, that offer stands, we'd be happy to partner and share data. I mean, nobody from New Hampshire gets the monthly reports that we do. If they wanted to see them, they could ask us.
So, anytime there's a spike, you report it in as close to real time as possible, but your general reports are reported monthly to the Mass Department?
Yep.
Okay. And just a couple more questions, if I might. How is your interaction with the NRC? I mean, are you designated by the NRC to conduct this work, or is it just through the Massachusetts?
This is a state contract, but I mostly talk to the resident inspectors, Paul Cataldo and Peter Muir.
And do they, I mean the NRC, inspect your equipment?
No.
Or approve it?
We do calibrate annually, and when we work with Department of Public Health, my boss through that, Jack Priest, used to work at Pilgrim in their radiation control. He's the head of the Bureau of Radiation Control. And, so that he knows very much about that we talked about our equipment, how we operate it, how we calibrate it.
But your protocols are done through the contract with Massachusetts Department of Health. Okay, I get it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So, one last question is the let's see, Dave and Megan don't believe this is necessary. They have lots of real-time monitoring going on within the confines of the station. What additional benefit would this arc of monitoring bring that would warrant the expense?
The expense is quite small, again, as we say, compared to numbers that we talk about elsewhere for public safety or Seabrook's operating. I can see why they wouldn't want an independent group. They've got us already. We're doing it in Massachusetts. I know that there are a lot of folks at Seabrook working for safety, but I don't think that they should see us as a threat, but as a complement to provide an extra extension of that. And I'd like to work in partnership with them. We live here too. We're on the side of safety.
Any other questions? All right.
Thank you so much.
Seacoast anti-pollution.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Doug Bogan. I'm Director of Seacoast Anti-Pollution League, which is based in Exeter. By way of introduction, or perhaps reintroduction, we're this year celebrating our 50th year of efforts to get clean and safe energy for the Seacoast region. And I'd like to provide some relevant information in support of SB 181. Given the recent identification of a pediatric cancer cluster in Seacoast communities down into Seabrook, we think it's all the more imperative that the state of New Hampshire and Seacoast residents have more information concerning routine radiation exposures in these and neighboring communities, as well as forewarning of increases in such exposures due to possible accidents or other unexpected emission releases. The Seabrook plant has been operating for 28 years now. While most of its neighbors are unaware of it, this plant and all other nuclear plants routinely emit radioactive gases and airborne particles, as well as liquid effluent, to the local environment on a regular course of their operation. While plant operators and regulators, no doubt, will tell you or have told you that these levels of routine radiation are permitted and are of no concern for surrounding populations, we are informed by the conclusions of the National Academy of Sciences BEER 7 report that, quote, there is a linear no-threshold dose-response relationship between exposure to ionizing radiation and the development of cancer in humans. In common terms, this means that any radiation exposure poses some risk to human health, and that any additional increases to one's exposure is cumulative and will increase that risk. Other research indicates that it matters whether the radiation source is external or internal to one's body, and some particles get bound up in certain tissues, organs, and bones for many years. According to the Seabrook operator reports, radioactive gases such as argon, krypton, xenon, and tritium are released in batches on a weekly or bi-weekly schedule from the vent on top of the containment dome. I don't believe they mentioned the airborne emissions in addition to the liquid ones. Prevailing winds, in the summer at least, are from the southwest, most likely sending these gases and particles up the coast over neighboring communities. And I don't think this was mentioned previously, that the prevailing winds are up the coast of New Hampshire, so it's all the more important to have monitoring downwind of the plant in New Hampshire as opposed to upwind. Most of these gas isotopes have short half-lives, but unfortunately some of them transmute over time into longer-lived, more radioactive elements like strontium and cesium that are known to be deposited in key organs and tissues when ingested. While the current Seacoast Cancer Cluster investigation is focused on incidences from the past decade, SAPL previously worked with the Radiation and Public Health Project of New York to access CDC county-by-county childhood cancer data for the previous 2 decades. They determined that there was a 19% increase in such cancers in counties surrounding Seabrook from the decade prior to the startup of the plant to its first decade of operation, while national rates from these cancers declined during the same period. More recently, and subsequent to the identification of a childhood cancer cluster in Seacoast, we again contacted the Radiation Public Health Project to look at CDC childhood cancer data for Rockingham County specifically. Again, there was evidence of a large increase in cancer mortality in comparison to the rest of the state over this pre- and post-Seabrook startup period. And you've also heard as well that New Hampshire is the highest in the country for childhood cancers overall. Given that other studies in the US as well as in Europe have found similar increases in childhood cancer rates surrounding nuclear power plants, we think that this issue and its possible relation to the Seacoast Cancer Cluster should be given better scrutiny. Going forward, our state should be collecting real-time data on radioactive emissions in downwind communities, not simply relying on on-site monitoring by plant employees or scattered quarterly cumulative measurements by state officials. We need this kind of data both to get a better handle on routine exposures to downwind residents, as well as for real-time responses to accidental releases. If there is a serious accident or sabotage at the Seabrook plant, neighboring communities will be poorly served and more subject to potentially serious health consequences if there is no in-place and independent monitoring of the resulting emissions. And also I mentioned that the history of nuclear power has shown that as plants get older, as Seabrook is getting into its elder years, there's more tendency for things to break down and to require more maintenance and potentially to result in increased emissions. The state of New Hampshire has appropriated funds every year, as we've heard, for emergency management preparedness. As I understand it, this amounts to several $1 million a year. I haven't seen recent figures, but even some years back, that was the level of funding, and that much of that funding is rightly collected from the owners of the Seabrook plant. So I asked, doesn't it make sense that a small portion of these funds, we're talking, 5 or 10% in terms of the maintenance cost of a monitoring system, be devoted to this monitoring of the very emissions that make emergency preparedness necessary. We question the high estimated costs provided in the fiscal note, but in any case, real-time monitoring should be manageable and appropriate use of these funds. So thank you for your attention to these comments, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. If you have written testimony,
I don't with me. I could provide some.
That'd be great. You can send it to Doug. Awesome. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Is there anybody else who wishes to speak? we will close the hearing on SB 181.